The hidden side of Islamic conquest. Simplified, history books love to praise the Islamic Golden Age, the great science, the mathematics, the art. But they stay quiet about the millions of people who suffered, who were broken, erased, and silenced during the rise of the Islamic empires. This is the side of history they never teach, and it comes not from enemies, but from the words of Muslim chroniclers themselves. The early Islamic caliphates didn't just spread religion. They spread domination, physical, psychological, cultural. They understood one thing: if you can break a people's spirit, you don't need to fight them again. That's what they did over and over, from North Africa to Persia, from India to the Balkans. One of the most brutal examples was the Devshirme, also called the blood tax. The Ottoman Empire, often glorified in modern media, created one of the most organized child trafficking systems in human history. Every few years, Ottoman officials entered Christian villages in the Balkans and took young boys, between 8 and 18, from their families. These weren't volunteers. These were children, chosen for their strength or intelligence, torn from their mothers and fathers with no way back. Resistance meant death. Entire families were threatened. These boys were dragged away, transported to Istanbul, and then converted to Islam by force. From that moment, their old identity was erased. They were forbidden to speak their native language. They were forbidden to contact their families. They were forbidden to follow their religion. They were brainwashed, told that their Christian families had abandoned them, told that the Sultan had saved them from ignorance, given new names, given new beliefs. Their loyalty was now to the empire, the same empire that had enslaved them. The best among them were trained to become janissaries, elite soldiers, highly trained, emotionally broken, completely obedient. These were not just fighters, they were weapons. Weapons created by tearing children from Christian homes and turning them into tools of war. Between the 1300s and 1800s, historians estimate 500,000 to 1 million Christian boys were taken like this. 500,000 childhoods stolen, 500,000 families shattered. And here's the darkest part. These stolen children were then used to conquer more Christian lands. The sons of Christians were turned into the soldiers who destroyed Christian villages. It was a perfect evil cycle. The conquerors didn't just take land. They turned victims into weapons. They crushed resistance not only through armies, but through identity theft. Families fought back in desperation. Some injured their own sons to make them unfit for selection. Others hid their children in forests or caves when the collectors came. But the Ottoman system was cold, methodical, and brutal. Once a child was selected, there was no escape. Imagine the fear. Imagine the knock on the door. Knowing your son could be taken, turned into a soldier, and return years later as your enemy. This wasn't a random horror. This was policy. This was systematic. This was approved by law and religious justification. And it wasn't the only system. The Islamic caliphates built many methods of control and domination, but this was one of the most terrifying. They didn't just take land. They took children. They took identities. They took souls. This is the part of history they don't want you to read. But it's real. It's documented. It's written by their own historians. And it's only the beginning. The slave trade and castration system. While the Atlantic slave trade lasted around 400 years, the Islamic slave trade stretched over 1,400 years. From the 7th century to the early 20th century, and what happened in that system is rarely taught today. But the truth is clear. millions of human lives were stolen, mutilated, and erased. The scale and cruelty were massive. At least 11 to 17 million Africans were enslaved and taken to Islamic lands. But the real number is likely much higher. And the horror was not just in the capture. It was in what was done after. One word: castration. Around 80% to 90% of the African male slaves brought into Islamic regions were castrated, either before transport or upon arrival. This wasn't rare. It was policy. It was systematic. Castration centers, like the one in Aswan, Egypt, worked like factories. Thousands of boys and men were mutilated each year. Why? Because Islamic law encouraged freeing slaves who converted to Islam. But rulers didn't want a permanent slave population, so they made sure slaves couldn't reproduce. It kept demand high, it kept control tight, and it destroyed lives. The mortality rate was horrifying. 90% of those castrated died during or after the procedure. They were seen as disposable. Those who survived became eunuchs, guards, servants, but never free, never whole, never truly human in the eyes of their masters. Women faced a different nightmare. The most beautiful were kept as concubines in harems, large groups of sex slaves owned by powerful men. Others were used for domestic work or simply traded like property. In the Islamic world, slave markets were common. Women were displayed naked. Buyers checked their bodies like livestock. Travelers like Ibn Battuta described these markets without shock. It was just part of life. And the price: a beautiful slave woman could cost years' worth of wages. These women were not wives. They had no rights. They could be sold, gifted, or killed. Their children were not legitimate unless the owner accepted them, which was rare. The impact on families was devastating. In many regions, parents scarred their daughters' faces to make them less attractive. Others locked them inside for years. That fear created a culture of female hiding that still exists today in some parts of the Muslim world. And the demand was endless. Because concubines didn't hold permanent status, they were constantly replaced. New girls had to be captured again and again, which meant more raids, more kidnappings, more broken homes. The Ottoman Empire alone is estimated to have enslaved over 1.5 million women for sexual purposes. From the Balkans, Caucasus, Africa, and Central Asia. This wasn't random cruelty. It was legal. It was religious. The Quran permitted sexual relations with those whom your right hands possess. Scholars turned this into full legal systems that allowed the buying, selling, and using of women as sexual property. These laws made it easy to justify what would otherwise be seen as crimes against humanity. Slavery was not hidden. It was organized, protected, and sacred, and it destroyed communities. Young men were castrated. Young women were captured. Families were shattered. Cultures were torn apart. And these weren't one-time events. This went on for centuries. Unlike in the Americas, where slave families could sometimes survive and grow, the Islamic system was designed to prevent that. It was built to erase identity, to control, to dominate. Even the powerful Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of Egypt, were born from this system, bought as boys, trained, converted, and used as warriors. Some became rulers, but even then, they continued the system, refusing to let their own children inherit power. They simply bought more slaves. This was slavery without mercy, slavery without future, slavery without soul. The damage reached across continents. Africa was drained of its youth. Villages were emptied by slave raids. Economies were destroyed. Cultures were silenced. And yet, the Islamic slave trade is almost never mentioned in schools, documentaries, or public memory. Why? Because truth is dangerous. Because truth breaks the illusion. Because truth demands justice. But we remember and we speak. This was not just history. It was erasure. Religious destruction and forced conversions. Islamic caliphates didn't just conquer land. They targeted beliefs. They broke religions, crushed traditions, and erased spiritual identities. It was not always done with swords. Sometimes the weapons were taxes, laws, and humiliation, but the result was always the same: submission or destruction. One of the key tools of religious control was the jizya, a special tax placed on non-Muslims. On paper, it was just a fee for protection. In reality, it was a tool of economic suffocation. In many places, the jizya was equal to several months of a family's income. For poor families, it meant choosing between paying the tax or watching their children starve. And paying the tax wasn't private. It was humiliating. Non-Muslims had to kneel, get struck, or publicly present themselves in degrading ways. It sent a clear message: you are second class. You don't belong. Over time, many gave in, not because they believed, but because they were broken. But taxation was only one part of the system. The real war was against religion itself. In Egypt, when Arabs conquered the land in 641 AD, they began destroying Coptic Christian monasteries and churches. These weren't just places of prayer. They were centers of learning. They held scrolls, books, and knowledge going back to ancient Egypt. That history was burned. In Persia, Zoroastrianism, the ancient faith of fire temples, truth and light, was crushed. Temples that had kept their sacred fires burning for over 1,000 years were put out. Texts were destroyed. Priests were killed or forced to convert. A whole civilization's soul gone in a generation. In India, the story was even worse. A warlord named Mahmud of Ghazni led multiple invasions between 1000 and 1027 AD. His chroniclers boasted that he destroyed over 50,000 Hindu temples. The most sacred sites, like the Somnath Temple, were smashed to rubble. Stones from broken temples were used to build mosques. A clear message: your gods are dead. Only ours remain. Conversions often happened in the ruins of these temples. The symbolism was brutal. Your God lost. Submit to ours. And the laws, designed to choke any religion other than Islam. Christians and Jews could not build new places of worship. They could not ring bells. They could not walk proud. They were banned from riding horses. They could not testify in court against Muslims. They were banned from carrying weapons. These weren't minor rules. They created a system of legal apartheid, a world where non-Muslims were outsiders in their own lands. The result: collapse. The ancient Christian communities of North Africa, which once gave the world thinkers like St. Augustine, disappeared. The mighty Zoroastrians, whose religion had shaped empires for centuries, shrank into hiding. Today, fewer than 200,000 Zoroastrians exist in the world. Once a global faith, now nearly extinct. These weren't isolated acts. They were part of a plan. Erase the past. Silence old gods. Control the future. Forced conversions weren't always done at sword point, but the pressure, economic, legal, and cultural, made other options impossible. And when the sword was used, it was swift and absolute. This was not tolerance. This was not peaceful spread. This was domination, spiritual, psychological, total. And the world changed forever. We often hear how Islamic caliphates protected Christians and Jews, but we forget the price they paid: silence, poverty, fear, disappearing one generation at a time. This was the slow death of entire religions. This was spiritual conquest, backed by law and fire, and still, there's more. Because they didn't just take lives and beliefs. They went after culture itself. Economic and cultural destruction. Islamic empires didn't just control people through religion and fear. They used money and laws to destroy other cultures. Heavy taxes, called kharaj, were placed on conquered lands. These could take up to 80% of a farmer's crops. If they couldn't pay, their land was taken and given to Muslims. In Persia, advanced farming systems were destroyed on purpose. The goal was to make local people dependent on Muslim rulers. Some regions never recovered. There were also people taxes. The Nubians had to send 400 slaves each year to Egypt. Other areas had to send young boys for military use. These constant raids hurt local economies and tore families apart. Trade was controlled too. Non-Muslims had to pay more to do business. Over time, this made Muslim traders richer and non-Muslims poorer. Cultural destruction was even worse. Libraries in Alexandria and Persia were burned. Ancient languages like Coptic and Old Persian slowly disappeared. Cities and rivers were renamed. Old traditions were banned. Schools that once taught local history and culture were replaced with Islamic schools. Whole civilizations that had survived many other empires were now erased. These were not random acts. They were planned actions meant to erase old ways of life and replace them with one dominant culture. And the damage can still be felt today.